No.
Okay.
You do you.
All right. Okay, so welcome. If you didn't know, you're in the Action Utah's Lunch and Learn series. We are here every month teaching people how to demystify the system or on an issue that is of concern to the majority of Utahns. So today we're going to tackle air quality and talk about that. First of all, we want to have you introduce yourselves so we know who's in the room and what brought you here today. Then we'll talk to our panelists, have a couple of questions, have them introduce themselves. We'll have time at the end if you have particular questions. And we also always leave time to go on a tour of the Capitol. If you want to have a tour of the Capitol, if it's your first time, if you have questions about that, we'd love to do that. So my name is Patti Cook. I've been with Action Utah for about 18 months. I am the Advocacy Educator. I help educate community members on accessible ways to get involved. So let's start over here. Can we start with you? Introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Carolyn Love. I was an intern this last year up here at the Capitol. I wanted to stay involved, and so now I'm a candidate for Eagle Mountain City Council.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm just up here trying to stay aware of what's going on at the state level.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm Angela McGuire. I just moved here, and I'm one of the new Action Utah graduate fellows.
Welcome.
My name is Advocacy. I am a graduate student at the University of Utah, and I'm also a fellow with Action Utah.
Very good. Thank you.
My name is Kathy Van Dam. I'm with the Wasatch Air Coalition, and I have a Facebook page that's WCAC, Wasatch Climate and Air Coalition, and I try and make it useful.
We love that word, useful. That's a good word. Yeah.
I'm Kay Stanke. I work for Leaders for Clean Air. I had a conversation with Jessica talking about how I can try to get more involved and just kind of understand more what's going on, so that I'm kind of here all day kind of listening to things and seeing how this whole process works. So
Wonderful.
I'm Colin Mosquito, and I work for the Utah Nonprofits Association. So just here out of interest and to learn more about air quality issues at Utah.
Very good.
I'm Melissa Nelson-Stipik, and I'm the Communications Director for Action Utah.
Awesome. Well, welcome. We appreciate you being here. We always appreciate when people come and want to participate more. So this last legislative session, there was a record number of policies for clean air, and there was also unprecedented funding for it. So we want to kind of talk about what happened in the last session, what's happening right now, and what we can look forward to in the next session. So let's turn some time over to our panelists to introduce themselves and what they do, and then we'll work forward from there.
great. Well, my name is Jessica Reimer. I am a policy associate with HEAL Utah, or the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah. And I focus on primarily our clean air work, but we also work on issues of renewable energy and promoting getting more renewables onto the grid, and then also we oppose nuclear waste coming to the state.
And I'm Josh Kraft. I am the Government Relations Manager for Utah Clean Energy, and we're sort of the other side of that second part of the coin in terms of most of our focus is on energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, and then increasingly work on conversations around climate change. And I'm the person up here at the Capitol, and thank you all for coming and listening and for adding your voice to this process. We need it.
Thank you.
I'm Andrea Himoff. I'm the Executive Director of Action Utah. And at Action Utah, we're working on a wide range of issues. We look at data that shows what Utahns care about most, and then we take the position of majority of Utahns on those issues, and we know that air quality is one of the top 3 priorities in the state. So it's one of our big priorities in-house. We develop some policy, we support a lot of policy, and we help community members get engaged in supporting good policies that help us clean our air, and within clean air, work on transition to renewable energy and solutions for climate change.
Awesome, thank you. So let's start with what was most notable, in your opinion, from the last legislative session?
Well, I think you kind of mentioned it. It goes without saying that the biggest, most notable thing that happened was that we got $29 million for air quality programming, which is the largest funding that air quality has had in the state's history. So think overall that was the most notable, which was interesting because it was not part of the typical bill process that you expect up here. It's actually more part of the appropriations process, which is a little bit more of a it's a hard process to track because it's not as transparent and open as the bill process is, and it's more kind of behind the scenes and happens through people requesting that money be spent in certain ways and through the budgeting process of the different agencies. And so it's kind of a side that I think the public especially doesn't know how to follow very well, and so it's kind of interesting that was the big win on air quality last year, that it really kind of happened through this appropriations process. But it also happened because of so many conversations that have been occurring over the past few years.
Yes. That's the interesting thing that I found is that policy work and funding it does take some time, right? So the funding that you did get, is that what you requested? The $29 million, or how did that work?
Well, I can let you guys weigh in too, but the governor had initially requested $100 million. Okay. So if you look at it from the overall, what the request initially was, we didn't get $100 million, but that's kind of the glass half empty view. But the glass half full approach is we got $29 million, and that can go a long way.
Yeah, that's still a great
just
win.
For frame of reference, we've gotten like 800,000 before for air quality. So if you look at it at the glass full perspective, it's a huge leap forward.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it was unexpected, and I think and that's not a bad thing. In terms of the governor putting that out as a request fairly late on, and I think, and if there's anything that legislators are concerned with, it's spending tax dollars, and I think that even when we have a budget surplus, and I think it was the fact that there was a lot of popular support for making air quality, clean air, and improved like a priority that may push that over the line. But I know there was some pushback there, and I'd also say Jessica's mentioning the appropriations process. This was the first year in my 3 years up here that I've followed the appropriations process really closely, and I was super confused. And I talked to some lobbyists who are a lot. I don't know. I think that they're better lobbyists than I am. Who were I was like, "What's going on with this bill?" They're like, "I have no idea. You can't read it." So it's important to follow and to making financial requests to make those early on, and we hope that some of those longer and medium and longer term air quality improvements that the governor maybe foresaw are something that might be thought on in the future. I don't, probably not in one session in terms of the $100 million.
I think another noteworthy thing, and we've kind of circled around it, is the growth in legislative support for these kinds of policies. Going to the Clean Air Caucus is a bipartisan group of legislators that was co-founded, what do you think, 10 years ago now?
13 or 14.
By Representative Patrice Arendt and others, and they've been meeting all this time, and it's really only in the last 2-ish years that suddenly droves of legislators are coming to these meetings. The audience has grown, and at the Clean Air Caucus's press conference every year, the lineup of legislators who are proposing clean air measures just has grown and grown and grown. So it was really striking in the last 2 years to see that, and really encouraging, I think.
That bipartisanship is really coming through now, I think, whereas maybe in the past it hasn't been quite so bipartisan.
So in your opinion, is there a particular thing that spurred that on? Because like you said, many people have been working on these issues for a long time. Is there one thing that happened that helped make this go through this time? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't think it hurt that the governor put together a $100 million budget. And it's not that legislators said, okay, we'll do $100 million. They said, well, it's our budget. We're going to decide what we want. But I think showing leadership in that way was really, really important.
I think, too, you're seeing a lot of leadership from other industries. There's more of an economic case to be made for addressing air quality at this point in time, especially as the state is looking to continue to grow both economically and our population is set to double in the next 30 years. So there's a lot of opportunity that I think legislators see, and air quality is one piece that could hinder some of that growth.
Yes.
And so I think that it's a recognition of both that and industries that are based here in Utah who, may be emitters, but who have had a lot of controls placed on them, and recognize that their potential industries are going to also be at risk if we don't get a little bit better control kind of across the board on air quality in general. There's a lot of back and forth that's happening and conversations that are happening now that I don't think were happening prior.
I love that.
And I think Jessica's underrating her own role here, that and Andrea as well, that, we have more of a strange bedfellows coalition around air quality measures than we have in the past, and that you can't just cook that up. You can write letters and someone will put their name on it, and that's helpful. And, the large businesses, but they were testifying and going behind the scenes. And I think that's something that you're not always going to have interests align in agreement there, but when you have it, you need to take advantage of it, because definitely legislators look at you in a different way.
So the advocates and the coalitions align to help that happen. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think it's the work of coalition building that has gone on for some time, and then of course, the fact that the EPA has a regulatory stick, I think, sort of has kept a watchful eye among some of the regulated entities to say, hey, we need to keep trying things, even if we've had some incremental improvement into the air quality in the last few years.
Yeah, one of our bills, our air quality bills last session, 2 of the major testimonies came from the Utah Manufacturers Association and petroleum. So you talk about strange bedfellows, but it's really a serious thing that there are a lot of partners who are interested in air quality now.
That's great to hear. And I love, Jessica, you mentioned about the growth of Utah being tied, the economics of it being tied to air quality, because that could be detrimental to people wanting to come to our state. So I love that we're working on all those angles. So as far as now, what you're doing now after the session, what kind of things are you working on right now?
Well, we're kind of at least from my perspective, we're at the stage where we're trying to figure out exactly what are the bills that can be run this year that have some legs and that are gaining some momentum. We heard last night at the Clean Air Caucus that Representative Handy is looking to run a bill that would address the non-road emissions in the valley, and just to kind of back up and give a sense of what that is. Non-road emissions are emissions from basically generators or engines that aren't driving on our roads, but maybe part of large construction equipment. So, mining trucks are part of that. Construction vehicles, agricultural equipment would be part of that. Small distributed generators. All of those kind of make up this non-road category that gets in kind of to the wonkiness of how things are categorized at the regulatory level. And those are emissions that, from a federal standpoint, or from the state standpoint, we don't have control over because of the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act prevents the states from regulating those emissions. And so we have a really hard time actually addressing those type of emissions. But one thing that we can do is figure out what exactly we have in the valley itself. And we don't have a good inventory of those vehicles to begin with. Any emissions that we see from that sector are based on a per capita model, essentially, that looks at how many people are in our valley, how much growth we see, and kind of makes an estimate as to what type of development we're seeing. And so those emissions are really hard to accurately quantify. And so Representative Handy is looking to help to just develop a registry that would allow us to get a better sense of the types of engines that are out there, how many of them, how old they are, and see exactly what the contribution of that sector is. We may find out that it's less than we think, and it's less of an issue than we initially have considered it to be, but we also might get a more accurate picture of what those emissions are.
Thank you. That's great to hear. Would this be a mandatory registry for people, or just something that they could decide, or how does that work?
I think that it would be analogous to how we register our own personal vehicles and how we're required to do that. I think that it would just put that same type of requirement onto the companies that own those vehicles.
Thank you. How about you, Josh?
Yeah, I think I'll just say that I think we're kind of all mapping out what kind of comes next, some of the bigger steps and the bigger chunks, and I'll name 3 things that we're trying to work on, and I'm sorry, we're a wonky group, so I'll try not to get too much into the details, but buildings are increasingly a large source of our emissions, and it's not the sort of smokestack of the past, but most of us have natural gas heating systems in our homes, and then that's true in our businesses as well. And so getting to existing buildings is an area where we can save energy and cut down emissions more generally, and finding ways to get more of those places more efficiently is really important. We want to at least maintain the programs that our utilities have for energy efficient buildings, and now we're seeing a lot of super efficient electric heating systems that are one way in which you can get into existing and new buildings and potentially eliminate emissions, for heating and cooling. And it's they're much more efficient. They're not going to leave you, super cold in the winter time, the way that some of those technologies did. Former Senate President Wayne Niederhauser was at the Clean Air Caucus last time talking about electric vehicle expansion. That was one area that was funded, and so we want to make sure that both charging and then also for passenger vehicles and then also electric buses continue to be something that expands, and we're just a tiny piece of that work. I don't know that we have any legislation like right now that we're thinking of on that front, but that's something that there's a grant program out.
I just wanted to say, don't downplay the fact that President Niederhauser was
No,
huge. About EVs.
Huge.
Because it's he's a very respected person in the legislature.
Yeah, and if you if you live in Senator Cullimore,
Cullimore,
if you're in his district, you might have some conversations about what's good there. But we're going to meet with him on Friday. For Wayne Niederhauser on Friday to talk through some of those things. Finally, HB 411 was the Community Renewable Energy Act that was passed last session. It's an innovative and interesting piece of legislation that we supported that would allow communities served by Rocky Mountain Power to move to what we're calling net 100% renewable energy. And I won't go into the details of what that means. It just would allow us to add those communities that wish to, and Salt Lake City, Park City, Moab, Summit County have kind of been the most interested in making that shift to kind of buy new renewable resources and offset some of the existing resources they have. So that's something that is in process right now. Legislature passed it right, and so we're talking with communities about how that might work for them. Sorry, I was long.
No, it's great. It's great stuff. Along those same lines, Action Utah works with a lot of different advocates, including these two, and we've been involved in this same HB 411 follow-up process to help these communities resolve to take on goals towards transitioning to renewable energy. And that's really been a follow-up as well to a resolution that we passed in 2018. We worked on together with Jesse and Josh, you were part of that as well, to recognize climate change in the state. And it was the first climate resolution ever passed in a red state in America, so it was quite a big deal for our state, and there's been a lot of follow-up to that, which is really exciting to see, and HB 411 is one of the great pieces of legislation that has really carried forward climate solutions. So we've been working on supporting that for them. In addition to that, some of the work that we're interested in right now is obviously exploring a lot of different bill possibilities for the 2020 session. We're looking a lot at vehicles. Jesse talked about non-road vehicles. But vehicles are one of our biggest emitters and one of the best things that individuals can do in terms of behavioral shifts that can reduce emissions. But in order to do that, we need those cleaner vehicles to be accessible, to be affordable, and so we're constantly looking for ways to help the state get more clean cars here and people to be able to access them. So that's one of the directions we're looking in. Another one is around LED light bulbs. So LED light bulbs, of course, are energy efficient. That means reduced emissions, so cleaner air. It means lower costs to consumers or taxpayers, depending on where those LED bulbs are. And it also means greater health, human health. So regular light bulbs, they can really impact our health, cause migraines, for instance. It causes, in schools, student absenteeism, lower concentration, and a lot of teachers can miss school because of the health impacts from bad light bulbs. And so we are looking at ways that we can potentially change out those light bulbs in schools to help with all those efforts. And it's a pretty cost-efficient method of cleaning up the air because those costs are recuperated over a few years. So that's one of the places that we're looking at, as well as how we can support community members in changing their behaviors in order to reduce their own emission output.
I love that. I think light bulbs are a great example of what happens here on the Hill affects everyday people, right? And something as simple as changing out light bulbs could help teacher retention and students and all those kind of things, and how important it is for us to get involved and to know what's going on. So from what you talked about, is there anything else that we could look forward to in the 2020 session that we should keep our eye on? I know you all said you're in development of several different things. Is there anything else we can look forward to or track?
Well, we're also thinking about kind of the 30,000-foot view of air quality and how it fits into the longer-term growth goals we talked about. And like Josh was mentioning, buildings are such a huge contributor to our emissions, and it's something that's really difficult to regulate just because these are a lot of smaller emissions that are just together add up to a big source. So we're trying to think about how can we, somehow get the state to kind of shift on a track that with these big developments that we see kind of happening throughout the valley, including, at the point of the mountain, the prison, the airport, the inland port, which people I hesitate to bring up because it's a very controversial issue at this point, but I think that there's a chance that it could be done in a right way. How do we kind of shift the ultimate goals of the state to have a kind of a smart growth mindset, and how do we incentivize that? Yes. The term smart growth is probably not the best term to use, but we can, how do we try to, prioritize, they call it transit-oriented development, where we're trying to see more kind of retail and housing developments around public transportation and getting all of these kind of services and residential areas and job locations in places that are close to each other, so people don't have to be commuting up and down the valley, and we don't have to be relying on our cars quite so much, and everything's kind of where we live. So it's kind of these ideas of prioritizing just these forward-thinking technologies and forward-thinking plans and growth patterns. That how do we incentivize those? So it's that's a long-term goal and a long-term lift, but what are the policies we can affect kind of on the ground today? And that's what we're trying to figure out.
Well, thank you.
I'd say that are two things to offer. I'd say that Jessica was mentioning the inland port, and I think that you think about windows of opportunity that you have. That's a challenging process, a controversial one where the community will be hosted and the legislature have fairly profound disagreements. But it's still a window potentially for citizens, community members to think about, okay, what can we work on, what can we extract from that process? The Olympics bid is another one of those things where sustainability, climate neutrality, renewable energy are goals that have been in the documents for that bid. And to be honest, I'm still fairly new to Utah, so I don't have a grand view on the Olympics bid, but it's something to think about. And finally, the Kempsey Garden Policy Institute is working on a climate and air quality and changing climate study that was a result mainly of the resolution that these folks of you all got past HCR 7 that's supposed to make some recommendations by the end of the year. We'll see how that process ends up, but again, it's a window of opportunity, potentially for the public to refer to some documents that are public by a respected source to make some recommendations. And I just want to say, but the other thing I want to say is to make a plug for work on climate change. We have climate change and air quality are distinct. They have many distinct aspects. They have some common medium and long-term solutions, many which I think are good for our state's economy and our health. But our junior senator, Senator Romney's been talking about some efforts on climate change. Representative Congressman Curtis in the 3rd District talked about that, and then Congressman McAdams in District 4 has talked a little bit about that. And I think that conversation is perceived to be too controversial here, and I hope that we can pick up the pace a little bit and have some conversations with legislators. It's not an easy conversation, and so you all will have to explore what works for you, but I do think it's something that's kind of ripe for exploration.
I agree, and I think some of the things that I'm looking forward to for this session are conversations starting pieces of legislation. So I'm hoping to see some legislation that does allow us to continue to have conversations about climate change and air quality, and specifically, again, around vehicles. I think there is the danger of passing $29 million in appropriations is that legislators would say, okay, we did it. We solved air quality. And we've got these tier 3 standards coming online, and so we've solved the vehicle emissions issue. And I hear that from legislators, and the more that we have bills coming in front of legislators, the more we can have conversations. And that's why it's important that you guys are in the room, because those conversations are not just us here at the Capitol, they're community members emailing and meeting with their legislators saying, hey, this is still really important, and by the way, yes, we're doing great things on air quality, and thank you, but there is a lot more to do, and if we do nothing else from this day forward, we're just going to increase emissions, even from vehicles, once our population grows beyond a certain threshold, and we can see that in models already. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had more and more so that legislators continue to support these policies and appropriations to help us continue forward with clean air measures and not just stop where we are.
I think that's a great point, to continue in the process, even though we've had some great wins along this front. Josh, I want to come back to you on, so if someone is new or in the beginnings, you said there's a difference between climate change and air quality, right? If someone's new into this arena, where's the best place to go to start, or to figure out the terms, or to know where to get their feet on the ground? I know that's kind of a big question, but I know there are people asking that.
I'd like to think that we have some resources on our own website that are a good place to start in terms of looking at some of the climate and air and energy efficiency, renewable energy measures. HEAL has a great website, a great resource, simple, easy to understand terms. The Utah Clean Air Partnership, UCARE, I think is another really good place to begin the conversations. And I'll give a shout out, I think, to our Department of Environmental Quality. If you organize and make requests of them, they're pretty responsive, and they'll follow through and give you the information that you're looking for. Work with Jessica, Andrea, Kathy, other people to kind of start that process, but I think it gets you you can get what you need.
Well, and there's also Utah Climate Week coming up for the kind of timely events. Utah Clean Energy is very involved in organizing that.
Many organizations.
Yes. A lot of organizations are having events, so kind of I know we're doing a few events. We may be collaborating on a few different things. And there's going to be events in Salt Lake, up in Park City, kind of all around the valley. So that's another good place to kind of connect in with a lot of the groups doing work on, at least in that case, climate.
So just jump in and then learn your way from there, because there's lots going on is what I hear you saying.
I mean, I think that's a good point, is to say, okay, you know that air quality matters to you. That's something you prioritize. So what are the organizations that are working on it? And maybe organizations that follow your personal philosophy or style, and join their email list. I mean, something really simple like that will help you stay informed. Look at what actions they're asking you to take. And a lot of websites, HEAL will do this, we obviously do it all the time, will say specific things that they would like to see community members doing to support their efforts and these policies. So it doesn't have to be that difficult. It doesn't have to be a big research project. It can be like, find that organization you can trust and just do what they're asking you to do.
And we make it a really low bar. We make it easy for people to get involved. Not that it's a low bar of the output, but it's easy to get in the process and get involved. And I think all of our organizations, Action does this, especially during the legislative session. We provide opportunities for people to come up here. Even this event right now is a perfect opportunity to get people involved, and so it's great that you all are here. That there are more of those, and always keep an eye out for them.
Thank you. And then one of my last questions is, each of you have talked about maybe legislators with this big one last year say, it's done, we've done this, or conflict over things like the inland port, or that smart growth is a long tail process. What would you say to advocates just getting involved with a legislator who might say one of those things, or dealing with those issues as they come up as people advocate?
You want me to start? I think that, this kind of, again, plugs our organizations, but I think we all try to do a good job of distilling the issues in a way that you can talk about all of the different arguments that are out there. I know that you do sometimes have to, approach an issue with an open mind and kind of meet people where they're at in terms of the issue itself. So, for example, climate change. If you go immediately to a rural legislator and start throwing information about climate change in his face, it's going to be an automatic turn off. You're not going to get a conversation with them that's actually going to be useful. But if you can approach it from the future and how are things maybe changing in your community, how do you see these changes on the ground, what could those be attributed to, and think about more of a solutions mindset and kind of have those and have that in the back of your mind, along with the kind of more concrete information that about the topic. I think that helps to open yourself and also be a resource for them rather than just being someone who's like yelling at them about something that you want to see done.
Building a relationship, it's an important and frustrating process as in this building. And I think that's, and I think that like when you ask for a meeting with someone or you're part of a meeting with a legislator and you bring up air quality, I don't think that you need to grovel. I think that they'll get that you think that there's still an issue to work through, and seeing work with Action Utah, work with HEAL, work with us on some things to know what they might have done in the past, and then at some point you try to see what steps they're willing to help you with and support, and if they don't, then you kind of know how to make your personal decisions about how to address that or move forward. But I think that there's a lot of like soft spots to continue to check up here, younger members of committees, and I would just say like committees when it comes to I know this is probably, most of you all probably know this, but committees when it comes to actual legislation are really, really important. And so, it's important to form a relationship with all legislators, but if you're thinking about a specific package of legislation, you need to know the committee of jurisdiction and how it's going to move forward. For us, it's usually public utilities and energy, natural resources.
Natural resources is
a fun
part
one.
of that. Yeah, air quality kind of gets split up.
Transportation is important.
Transportation,
Yeah.
public utilities. Yeah,
Sorry, that was a long
resources
answer.
are-
I think it's.
No, that was great.
We talk about a lot of different ways that people can engage with elected officials, and I think it's really important to remember from the beginning that part of building a relationship with an elected official, that every time you're emailing someone, that is part of building a relationship to begin with. So if you're emailing someone and you write an email that is in all caps, you're yelling at them. If you don't say, "Dear Representative so-and-so" or Senator so-and-so, you're not even providing a salutation. I mean, this is a human being at the other end of your email, and if you want them to receive your communications well, you have to treat them that way. And secondly, it's okay to feel disagreement or even anger about decisions that legislators make, but it is not effective to show that. So, if you feel angry at something that somebody did, what you can do is try to educate them in a civil way, in a concise way with facts. But yelling at them with emotion is not going to change their minds. So you want to meet them, like Jesse said, where they're at and using their own language. And so it's really helpful to do a lot of listening, actually. Part of building a relationship is building that two-way street. It is a dangerous step to assume that you know how a legislator feels about an issue at all, or why they feel that way. And so really listening, you can dig into what are their values and what are their priorities around this particular issue. Where can you find common ground so that you can realize that actually you probably have a lot of agreement on it, and where you thought they were coming from may not be where they're coming from at all. So I think just being really open-minded about having real conversations matters.
Awesome, thank you. I love that. The relationship building, also figuring out the committees that might matter and talking to all the committee members about things. Those are important. As we wrap up, is there any other last shout out you want to make about air quality, about what's coming up, about what people can do to help? Any last words?
I have one.
Yeah.
Every action that you take matters. And we have 1,000 events, it feels like, every year where we invite legislators and they give tips to community members about how to advocate, how to be a good community advocate. And they talk about counting their emails. They really do that. And so one rule of thumb is if you're not advocating, somebody else may be on the other side of your issue. And if you're not speaking up for what you want, someone else may not be. So it really matters even to spend 3 minutes writing a civil, concise email to your legislator and make sure they know you're a constituent, because they really do want to hear from you, and it matters.
Yeah, I think people discount their ability to have an influence, and there's a chance that some of these legislators hear from constituents maybe a few times a year, especially in places that, have fewer constituents that are living in the same area. And so, it's totally worth the time and the effort to reach out, because it's likely that you are one of very few people that are actually doing it in a way that is effective.
One of my first memories up here was the legislative session started basically, there was the 2017 Women's March. The building shook. And legislators cracked jokes about it, mostly respectful, but somewhat condescending. But nonetheless, they noticed. And I think that's just to note that, and to some extent, our jobs are to come up here and have difficult conversations, sometimes get yelled at, and oftentimes be disparaged when we're not in the room. But at the same time, it's just, I do think that state politics continue to be an underrated area for us to delve in and get policy work done, and that this is still a ripe area. Mm-hmm. I don't know that this coming session, I expect it'll be an interesting one, maybe not a great one for air quality and clean energy. We don't quite know yet. The governor's on happening his last year. We don't know what he's going to prioritize, but I think this is an clean air. I think renewable energy continue to be really, I think, ripe areas for citizen engagement. So I thank you for listening to us and your effort.
Yeah,
we still have $71 million we need to get.
I know. Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't know how good it'll be.
So we have a couple minutes for questions. If any of you have questions of our panelists. Anybody have anything they want to ask or add?
Can we talk about the controversial inland port?
Sure. What would you like to talk about?
What do you think? I know that the city is kind of settled, and so they're not going to be able to develop. Whoever owns that land, there's like 7,000 acres, and the city has kind of made a concession where they won't be able to develop like 3,000 acres of that. But what on the policy side is going to help reduce pollution for the inland port specifically?
So the inland port's the policy levers are interesting regarding the whole thing, because like you mentioned, the land is not owned by the state, nor is it owned by the city. It's actually owned by private companies or private individuals. And technically, they have the ability to go and develop as they wish. The policy levers that the inland port has introduced is that and this was kind of part of the whole issue between the city and the state, and the issues that they've kind of been addressing over the last couple of years. But the state essentially took control of the tax that would be generated from those developments in that area and gave it to this Inland Port Board Authority. And so the board is actually the one that is going to be utilizing that tax, and it's kind of the one main policy lever that the board has in terms of jurisdiction over that area. And so with that, if we're thinking about it in terms of how can we, incentivize sustainability measures and try to reduce emissions from that. Well, from the conversations I've had, the plan is to, with that tax, they call it tax increment or tax differential, they want to be able to offer basically very low interest loans to these these companies, developers, that want to build something that would benefit from having this intermodal hub out in that area. And with that, in order to get that loan, they would have to agree to, some sort of operational limits, whether that's, building their buildings to certain standards, requiring trucks that are utilized in the port to have certain emission standards, any number of things, investing in X amount of renewable energy to offset some of the generation, the electrical generation that could, be increasing. So that's, I think, the main policy lever that we're going to see coming out of this. And that's all kind of based on contracts and things that, unfortunately, we still don't know enough about the port itself and what the plans are and what's going to make it this economic boon that everyone is saying it's going to be. But I think that there are opportunities to try to utilize that process to make it a more sustainable thing than it's currently being talked about and that is currently kind of the message that's being put out there. That's not to say that there's the chance that it won't be a super high polluting development, but I also think that there's a lot of opportunity for it to be something that we can showcase some of these new technologies and develop in a sustainable way.
Anyone else have a question?
Oh, just one other additional thing. I learned recently that the board, I can't remember exactly the whole thing that the board passed, but there is a 5% of the tax generated, I think, is going to be set aside for sustainability measures. And that's something that I don't think very many people know. And to be honest, they haven't put enough PR out there about. So there are some opportunities.
Yeah, we have not been engaged significantly in the discussions around the inland port. I mean, I do think that, they've hired Jack Hedges, who was previously at
LA Port.
Port of Los Angeles, and has talked about making this a very sustainable port. And that is probably a sunny characterization of what may occur, but it's important, I think, that's a potential lever. I don't think the final chapter is written on what's going to happen with the port.
Yeah. I think it's wide open at this point, to be honest.
Kathy, you have anything to add?
Well, I really will be interested to see what's the outcome of the press conference today where they delivered letters to the leadership asking for a health impact study. That is very interesting. I was really interested. I heard Bryce say yesterday that...
Bryce Bird?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, good. That they didn't have any requests for carrot funds this year.
And
that the first year they used 100% of their funds, the second year they used, I think, 30%, I think, and then this year they got no requests.
And just to provide context, the CARET Fund stands for the Clean Air Retrofit and Replacement of Off-Road Technology. And that's essentially like lawnmowers, snow blowers, those types of small emitters. They have a program that they can change out this equipment. We're trying to figure out how to actually better utilize that fund, because those smaller emitters are one, it's one source. But some of the non-road technology that we see with the construction vehicles, like I was mentioning, I think there's an opportunity to potentially leverage some of those dollars to replacing some of these big, older emitters. So you make a good point, Kathy, that's something to try to capitalize on.
I was also curious. One of the things I was listening to you talking about, the glass half empty and the glass half full. And that's one of the things that I think we may shoot ourselves in the foot with the legislature a lot of times, because many of the newspaper reports and advocate comments were about where's the rest of the $100 million? And we got so much, and that was really. And one of the things I thought was really sad, recently Salt Lake City gave a bunch of awards to buildings that did their benchmarking. And the headline on that was off to a slow start. Mm-hmm. And it was dynamite what has been accomplished. Mm-hmm. And I think that these guys up here who they work hard. And most of them are so good-hearted. You get to know them, and you have to admire the dedication and the intelligence and the energy that they bring is just so admirable, and they get spoken to so rudely. and it would be really nice if we could remember to appreciate the fact that they are, in the best sense of the word, public servants. But anyway, I would like to see CPACE for residential areas. That's enough from me.
Thank you. And did you have our last comment over here, or question?
Sure, yeah. Kind of piggybacking on inland port comments, what can cities, let's rephrase that just a little bit. What can cities and towns do, or what kind of impact can they have on air quality? What can they do?
That's a great question.
I mean, huge.
Yeah.
Because emissions start at the local level and work their way up. I mean, there's something to be done in your own home. There's something to be done in your community. There's something to be done in your city, in your county, in your state, and in your nation. Yeah. And all those things matter. Every single one of those things matter. So maybe you guys can talk to some of the very specific things that municipalities are doing towards this.
I mean, there's a lot. I think that, Kathy mentioned the building benchmarking ordinance that Salt Lake City has. That's a way to do transparency, at least for larger commercial buildings. And if you live in a small residential community, that may not work for you, but some of the larger communities in Utah could do that for sure. Certainly residential zoning and finding ways to work with the legislature and UTA on public transportation, I think are a really big and important way to help with air quality of life. We're still having, I think we're going to start having harder conversations about parking and biking, and that's going to be a local conversation with your friends and neighbors. And there's, and I don't know, I think also working with the League of Cities and Towns, which is the association for all the communities, I think their potential leverage point that all the communities have at the legislature, they have a good voice and their respective voice in terms of driving policy. That's not to be understated. If your mayor, city council is organizing and forming on that, that can be the league could potentially be a way of influencing higher level policy. They worked pretty closely with us on HB 411 at the end, and it was very helpful to have them talking with legislators and their perspective.
Yeah, I think some things like that Salt Lake City has done is incentivize and invest in electric vehicle infrastructure. I think, you know, given that vehicles, like Andrea has mentioned, you know, are a huge part of our source of emissions collectively in the valley, you know, over time we're going to really need that EV infrastructure to make people feel like they can own an electric vehicle and actually use it and not be scared they're going to get stranded somewhere, which is still, I think, one of the major barriers to adoption of electric vehicles. And Kate from Leaders for Clean Air might be able to speak towards more of that, about that. But that's, you know, one thing I think things that are happening at your city councils, they make decisions, you know, Salt Lake City acts as a redevelopment authority. I think that there are things that happen at that level that maybe aren't really on anyone's radar, even our radar. We don't pay too much attention to what happens there, but I think there are a lot of decisions around zoning, like you mentioned, and, you know, approval of different projects that, you know, maybe there is an opportunity to put, like I talked about with the inland port, like require some, you know, sustainability measures be part of those processes, and maybe it's a project by project basis, but anything that we can get into the conversation would help. So yeah, it's a little bit piecemeal, it's a little bit kind of a checkerboard, but there's a lot of different strategies to take.
I would add the anti-idling ordinances to that list too, which just got some press this week because legislators really kicked that off after a group of fifth graders stood up and said, hey, do we have to be spewing this in our faces all the time? And that's a measure that I think is really just educating community members at the end of the day to change our behaviors, and policies that are put forth that way to help us change our behaviors are incredibly effective as well.
I guess it really depends on the community.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's best to go with what the community wants. If there are some approaches or tasks that is favorable to in one community, like getting net 100% renewable energy in Salt Lake City, that's great. That might not work for Sandy. That might not work for other communities. So kind of using the community as a way to push things forward based on the wants of the local people, I think, is important.
We're seeing a lot of local sustainability committees prop up, and I apologize if I'm like that's been around for a while, but I think there's definitely some new ones, and that's just a nice vehicle. You know, everyone needs to prioritize their time, but it's potentially a way to get information to city councilors. So, and you don't need to know a ton of information, you know, to go to meetings. That's not the point. The point is to like ask for resources and stuff that you can work on within your community and move on from there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists for their time, their expertise, and sharing their stories with us on how to get involved in what's happening with air quality. And for those who'd like to stay, we'll give a tour of the Capitol. If you're watching on Facebook, if you have comments or questions, please leave them. And we'll see you next month. Same time, same place.
Thank you. Thanks for all being here.
Thank you.